Well, we are starting this new series, as Sean sort of hit on a few minutes ago, but we're starting this new series today called Tug of War, and it's going to be a 5-week series through the book of Romans, and you just need to know this, the book of Romans is a deep book, it is a heady book, it is theologically just sort of like, it's a theological type book, and so we could have easily spent about 5 months on the book of Romans, but we're just going to see how 5 weeks goes. So this should be interesting. But you might be wondering, well, Ryan, what's the play on Tug of War? Like, what is that? Why that title for a series like this? And here's how I would explain it. A couple months ago, as I was preparing and working through and writing this series, I couldn't help but notice some contrasting things that Paul would play with in the text. And again, this is the Apostle Paul that wrote the book of Romans, and things like this. Like today we're going to talk about choosing to follow the world or choosing to follow Christ, right? And so it's kind of like there are these two entities and there's this tug of war between the both that a lot of us feel. Am I going to follow the world and what the world wants from me, or am I going to follow Christ and what Christ wants from me? And it's kind of like Paul's just saying, hey, which side of the rope are you going to grab? We'll see as the series plays out that this is kind of a theme throughout much of the book, and it'll be a theme throughout many of the weeks as we dig in. Like, am I going to align myself with the old covenant, or am I going to align myself with this thing, the new covenant that Jesus establishes? And which side of the rope am I going to grab? And so again, a lot of this for us, for you and me, is going to just be this sort of challenge to think through, okay, where am I grabbing on, and how hard am I going to pull? And how am I going to align myself with Jesus? How am I going to align myself with the things that he wants for me? And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to start in Romans chapter 1 here this morning. We're going to be just in this little section here, verses 14 through 17, just 4 verses here today. And if you don't have a Bible, as I say every week, we'd just love for you to grab one, follow along on the carts, or it'll be up on the screen behind me. You can grab a Bible on your way out if you don't have one at home, and that could just be our gift to you. If you're looking for the book of Romans here this morning, it's in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. And so again, we're going to be in chapter 1. Before we jump in though, I want to give just a little bit of background. I want to give you a little bit of context, some history, some historical context on what's happening here in the text, who Paul's writing to, because I think it does play into helping us understand, especially as we're going to spend the next month or so in this book. So first and foremost, let's just start here that it is written by this guy named Paul. Now again, if you've been around for any amount of time, you probably know some of Paul's story, but I also know that we have many people who maybe just started attending here or are new to this whole church thing. Someone invited you, and this is all really new, so I'll give you just a 15-second snapshot of Paul's life and who he is. See, Paul was an individual who was a very zealous Pharisee. So again, Jesus was always at tension with the Pharisees because they didn't have the healthiest grasp on religion. They used it to a lot of times belittle people, beat people down. Well, Paul took it to a whole nother level. Paul actually went around murdering, imprisoning, and persecuting Christians. That was what he thought God was calling him to do, until one day Jesus himself appeared and said, Paul, stop doing that. Paul ended up flipping sides completely and became the most influential person in the history of our faith other than Jesus himself. Paul wrote much of the New Testament. Paul also planted many, many, many churches throughout the first century. He just went around planting churches. And so what we're going to read here today is a letter written by Paul to the church in Rome. Now, again, I want to tell you a little bit about this letter specifically, okay? Let's just start here. In this letter, different than really any other letter that Paul writes throughout the New Testament, when you're talking about like 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and you look at Corinthians, and you look at all these different letters that Paul writes, often what Paul is doing in these letters is he's writing out of a sense of correctedness. He's trying to correct something that is happening in these churches in these different places. And so maybe there's like a theological sort of discrepancy happening in this church. Paul would write a letter to this church, and the heart of the letter was, hey, I'm hearing this. I'm hearing that you guys are a little off base theologically. Here's the truth. Here's what you need to know. okay? Or maybe it's like a moral failure. We find this in one letter that somebody's is having relations with somebody's like mom or stepmom, and he's like, no, let's not do that, okay? That's icky. Let's not do that, okay? And so again, Paul would often write these letters out of like a need to correct or to help or to guide people. Romans isn't that. Romans is sort of just written out of this pure heart where Paul's like, hey, here's a whole bunch of theological stuff. As a matter of fact, the book of Romans, as we begin to probe in, we recognize that Paul doesn't even know these people. Not only does he not know them, he didn't plant this church. This is just a movement that's happening in Rome, and he's writing and he's sharing with them. And again, as you get towards the end of the book, and I would love if you would just go home and read through this throughout the next month or so. One thing that we notice is that it seems like maybe the motivation for Paul in writing the book of Romans is he's recognizing that his work is done in the area that he's been ministering, and now he's feeling a call to move west. And so he writes to this church, these people in Rome. He says, hey, here's what I believe. Here's the gospel. Here's how I align. Here's what you need to know about the truth. And here's where I think you align as well. And so just to make sure that we're in tune with one another, I'm passing through. I need to go west. And maybe it seems like Paul is essentially saying, like, you guys could be a base camp of sorts for me. Maybe you could help to support me as I continue my journey. And you could be my brothers and sisters who I lean on. And so this might be why it's so deep theologically, why there's so much happening here in the text, because he's just putting it all out there. He's saying, here's what I believe. You need to know this because this is what I'm preaching. And we could do this together. We could advance this movement together. So there's a lot happening there, but I'm going to just jump right in. We're going to be in Romans chapter 1. We're going to be in verses 14. We're going to go, like I said, all the way through 17. And as we read, I'm just going to go ahead and say this. We're going to do a lot of just starting and stopping and starting and stopping. I'm not going to read the whole text all the way through in just one foul swoop. We're going to break it down as we go. So let's jump in. Here's what it says in verse 14. Paul writes this, and again, this is just the last little section of like the introduction to the letter. He says, I am obligated to both to Greeks and non-Greeks. So let me stop right there. He says, I am obligated to both Greeks and non-Greeks. So some of you I'm reading out of the NIV translation. Some of you might not have the NIV translation. You might have a different one, and that's totally fine. But one thing that you might notice in that is that there might be some different phrasing. Like some of our Bibles might say this. They might say, I am obligated to both the Greeks and the barbarians. Now, you and I would look at that and we would say, this is a little fishy. Like, why is Paul using such harsh language to anyone who's not Greek? Like, what's going on here? And this isn't Paul being rude. This isn't Paul, he's not Greek, right? He's not being racist. This isn't some sort of slur that he's throwing out there. Actually, Paul's just speaking the language of the Greeks. He's trying to meet them where they are. Because how those within Rome and how those within Greece, how they would refer to anyone who was not Greek was, well, they're barbarians. And so Paul is trying to meet them exactly where they are. Again, if you have an NIV Bible, it's just going to say non-Greeks because modern translators try to make it more understandable for you and I, but let's keep going. He says, I'm obligated to both the Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish, or the wise and the unwise, or the educated and the uneducated. And so again, this is Paul saying Greeks, non-Greeks, educated, uneducated. Essentially, we could just stop right here. If Paul was here this morning and he was reading this text to us or he's communicating to us, this is kind of his way of saying, like, you know what? I'm going to stop by the cafe later. I'm going to grab one of those t-shirts that says Jesus for all people. This is kind of his Jesus for all people statement. He's just saying, listen, I think that the gospel is for everyone. I want to communicate it to everyone, Greek, non-Greek, educated, uneducated, rich, poor, addicted, sober, abled, disabled. I just need to profess it to as many people as possible. He says more about this as we get into the text. But I want to point this out as well, is that the movement of Christ that is really just becoming a transformative thing in the first century, it actually started primarily with a lot of uneducated people, not stupid people, but not those folks that are like, scholarly. I mean, you go back and you read like Jesus's, who he's ministering to primarily, it's a lot of farmers and fishermen and sort of individual carpenters, individuals that are kind of, they're not like highly educated. They're just normal people. And then over time, all of a sudden these more highly educated people start to buy in and they start to say, wow, there is something really to this. There's something happening here. Paul says, man, I came for everybody. And then verse 15, he says this. He says, that is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. He says there's this urgency, there's this eagerness for Paul to leave this place that he's done work for a while now. He's preached the gospel, and now he's saying, all right, we're going to go through, and I'm coming to you guys, Rome, and maybe I can hang out with you guys for a little bit, and we can fellowship, we can have a good time, and we can have some theological conversation. But then I'm going to move out, and we're going to continue to grow the kingdom and plant more churches and do more stuff. And here's again, I can't help but notice this. For Paul, he says there's this eagerness to preach the gospel. There's this urgency. I have to do this, and I have to do this to all people. I have to share it to anyone that'll listen. For Paul, this was like Paul was the catalyst. Like Paul had to call out Peter at different points for actually being kind of racist, like against people who weren't Jewish. Paul, his whole heart was, no, I believe Jesus for everyone. And so he took the message to the Jews and the Gentiles. And he did it with an urgency. And then he goes on to say this. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith and from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Or again, in the original transcript, it would say, the righteous will live faith to faith. There's a lot happening in that last little section. There's this powerful phrase, which we'll get to in just a minute, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I gave up all my, again, we have to remember that Paul was a Pharisee. He was respected. He had authority. He had influence. He was the guy that when he walked into a room, people feared him. People revered him. And Paul left all of that behind and said, I'm going to go do this Jesus thing now. I'm going to go and do everything I can to make Jesus famous and to let that be the message that rings through, and I'm going to plant these churches. And again, there's this really, like we read that and we say, cool, like not ashamed of the gospel. No, like Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. Paul would communicate it, he would share it, he would go to prison for it, he would do whatever he could to make sure that people knew the good news of Jesus. But as we look at just a couple more things, as we look at his writings, I'm sort of connecting the dots here. Like Paul, again, he goes on to say, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Again, hashtag Jesus for all people. He says, for in the gospel for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. So let's connect the dots here for just a moment. Gospel means good news, right? And so here's what he's saying. He's saying the gospel leads to righteousness. And then he goes on to say this. He says, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just is written, the righteous will live by faith. So he's saying the gospel leads to righteousness. What is it to be righteous? It is to be virtuous. It is to be someone who is striving to walk step in step with God. Not perfection, but you are striving to be someone who is virtuous, who is upholding morality, who is someone who again is walking step in step with the desires that God would have for us. So again, Paul's saying, the gospel, the good news, leads to righteousness. Righteousness leads to a deeper faith. And then he does this at the very end. Again, I'm just unpacking all this that we see in the text. At the very end, here's what we see. He says, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. Now again, you and I, we might read this and we would just say, okay, this is cool. It sounds kind of powerful. Paul's feeling preachy here. This is nice. But I love this when authors do this in the New Testament. When you read these words, like it kind of gets me excited. When they say, just as it is written, and then there's some sort of pull, some sort of quote from the Old Testament. And for me, often when I see that, my question is, I wonder what that text actually says that they're pulling from. Because this is just a snippet. And so here's what I did. I went back and I looked. And this is actually, this little section that he pulls from here is actually from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. I want to read it to you here. Again, this is in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. Here's what it says. It says, look at the proud. They trust in themselves and their lives are crooked, but the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. So here I'm looking at the Apostle Paul. We can just leave that up there for just a second. I'm looking at the Apostle Paul. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Also, let's understand just a little bit of context in which Paul is writing. He's writing to a church in Rome, not a Christian nation. Yes, these people that are receiving the letter are Christian people, but they're ministering in a very difficult circumstance. They're existing in a very difficult circumstance. They're existing in a place that a lot of this Jesus stuff isn't so highly palatable. So again, let me throw that passage back up just one more time. That Habakkuk passage, let's read it one more time. Look at the proud is what this prophet from the Old Testament writes. They trust in themselves and their lives are crooked, but the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. I think there's a reason that Paul throws to that passage. He says, essentially, he's quoting Habakkuk who says, look, there are two ways that you can live your life. You can be someone who in your pride says, I'm going to walk how I want to walk and I'm going to live how I want to live and I'm going to make choices that I want to make and just, you know what, just everyone else just get out of my way. This is my life. I'm going to live it. Or you can walk in righteousness of God. And you can say, Jesus, I want to walk with you. I want to walk in your direction. I want to walk this gospel thing which leads to righteousness and righteousness leads to a deeper faith. And I just want to pursue you, Jesus. And we see Habakkuk here in this old passage. We see this tension between you can go the world's way or you can go God's way. And then Paul says the same thing in this passage. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'll tell anyone that'll listen. I'll tell the Greeks and the barbarians, the non-Greeks, whatever one you call them. I'll tell the educated, the uneducated. He goes on later to say, I'll tell the Jew and the Gentile. I'll tell anyone. And this isn't an easy thing for those in Rome as he would come through and he's now preaching this gospel message. They're going to say, this guy's crazy. Because again, this gospel message is not the most palatable. It's not the easiest thing for people outside of a Christian context to understand. But here's what Paul, in a nutshell, he's saying, I don't really care how I'm viewed. I'm obligated, he says. And there's an urgency in my spirit to communicate this. And he's not saying it out of some sort of puff chest or some sort of like pride. He's saying it out of like, no. He says this in another letter. We just read this last week or a couple weeks ago. He says this in his letter to the Corinthians. He says, the love of Christ compels me. I'm doing this because the love of Christ has transformed me and I want that love to transform others. And so I'll go to this unpopular place. And I'll communicate this unpopular message. And I'll risk, if you read through another one of Paul's letters, you read through Philippians, you read through some of in Philippians, Paul says, no matter what, no matter the persecution, no matter the hardship, I'm just going to walk in this urgency and this joy that the Lord has given me to proclaim this message. And here's why I think this is so timely for us. This letter that Paul writes in Romans here and writes to the Romans. Here's why this is so timely, because I think you and we are struggling as Christians to know how we engage a culture around us where the message that we have isn't so easily received. I guess I would phrase the question this way: how do we walk in love for all people? That is our vision as a church. How do we walk in love for all people while holding to theological convictions that are unpopular in our culture? That's a tough question, isn't it? Because here's what I'm recognizing, and here's what we're seeing more and more, is that there are a fair amount of churches that have begun to say, well, culture's going this way, things are shifting this direction. It's not popular to believe some of the things that are in here and to stand firm on those things. And so you know what, we're just gonna, never mind. And yet we say that this is the inspired word of God. We say that it's inerrant. We say that God breathed this, that God worked through guys like Paul and put this together. And so we read this and we find these different passages that say these different things. And yet culture continues to pull and pull, that tug of war, pull and pull. And there are many of us as Christians who are saying, we're trying to play this out. Well, how do I love people? While at the same time holding to these convictions that I find in Scripture. So again, here's what a lot of churches are starting to do. Here's what a lot of individuals are starting to do. They're just saying, well, you know what? We'll just sort of disregard this, and we'll just. It's fine. God is love. And this is where we get a little bit uneasy in the room, right? Because God is love. But here's what I know also, and something that I've gathered about this thing that is love. It's this, that love isn't passive. See, let me just walk that out for a second. One of my greatest pet peeves, it's probably my biggest pet peeve, if I'm being honest, is when people misrepresent or mischaracterize Jesus to fit him into the agenda or the initiative that they want to move forward. And so what we see is there are folks who will say, well, you know, Jesus is love, so he's just good. And what we do is we sort of just passively, in the name of Christ, unfortunately, what we'll do is just passively go around and just pat people on the top. Hey, I don't want you to feel bad about yourself. So I'm just going to fluff your hair a little bit, and Jesus loves you, and we just and God is love, and just don't feel bad, okay? You're fine. Because again, we feel this pressure from culture to just sort of give in, and it's just this tug of war, just pulling and pulling and pulling, and we forget, and this is why I hate this, because we think Jesus is just this sort of like, just passive, like gentle, like, just guys, can we just get along, just pass the doobie, okay? Can we just like all be happy and fine, and and that's not Jesus. Yes, Jesus was love. Yes, it overflowed. Yes, God is love. Yes, we are to be an extension of love. Yes, that's how we're supposed to work. But Jesus also stood for things. Jesus looked at this and said, this is the word of God. When you read through the Old Testament, like Jesus quoted it, Jesus knew it. Jesus had moments where he didn't just passively say, hey, if it hurts your feelings, don't worry about it, just do it. No, Jesus, there's so many moments. Remember the rich young ruler, he comes to him and he says, hey, I want to follow you, Jesus, and I want to go to heaven. What do I have to do? And Jesus doesn't say, you know what, just come here. Let me give you a back rub for a second. Let's just do this. It's okay. Are you feeling okay? Now here, if you're okay with it, would you just sell all your possessions to the poor and then you can follow me? Then he says, no. Remember, the rich young ruler says, no. And so Jesus says, sorry, man. The guy walks away. Jesus doesn't say, you know what, that was kind of steep. You're right. Let me you got a knot in here. Let me work that out. You know what? Let's bring it down. Let's bring it down a notch. Let me make it easier for you. Remember the adulterous woman? She's dragged into this horrific situation. She's caught in the act of adultery. She's brought before Jesus. The Pharisees and the religious leaders are trying to trap Jesus. They put him in this really tough situation, and they say, Jesus, the law says that we should execute her. What are you saying? Jesus is stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if he breaks Moses' law and he doesn't execute her, then he's in trouble with the Jews. And if he says, yeah, let's stone her, let's execute her, then he's in trouble with the Romans, who have authority over the Jews, and they don't have the authority, the Jewish people, to practice capital punishment. And so they think they got him, and Jesus says, no, whoever has no sin, you cast the first stone. And everyone drops their stones and they walk away, and Jesus is brilliant and he's amazing and he shows love, but then he says to the adulterous woman, he says, now stop being adulterous. He doesn't go over to her and say, hey, can I just, what do you need? Can I just brush your hair for a little bit? Can I do this? Can I just, oh, look at that. Look, you need to use more conditioner. Can I just do this? And then she says, and he says, but could you just stop? Could you just stop for a little bit with the adultery? And then she says, no, I really like adultery. And he's like, okay, all right, that's fine. He doesn't do that. This is why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. This is why it's hard for us, though, because Jesus is love. Jesus exudes love. He is the definition of love. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, my favorite verse in the whole Bible, says God is love. God is love, but we can love without being passive. Jesus loved without being passive. As a matter of fact, in John 15, I want to read these words. Verses 18 through 23, Jesus says this. These are Jesus' words. He says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Jesus says, I've chosen you out of the world. He says, remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. We don't quote that one very often. See, I don't want you to mishear me. Maybe you're here today and you say, well, I came here because Jesus for all people and thought this was a place where I could work my stuff out. Okay, yes. But I don't want you to get a misunderstanding about who Jesus is. Jesus says, the good news leads to righteousness. And so we should all be, as followers of Jesus, on a journey and a path towards righteousness. And if we're pursuing and following after Jesus, then our hearts should be to love like Jesus. And love isn't this passive thing. Love compels us. See, we don't like this. We don't like this, but here, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Just this opening verse again. Jesus said, if the world hates you, keep in mind, it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. I'll go this far, and this is not popular, and this is not a good church growth strategy. If your faith plays out in such a way that everything is passive and everything is brushing and applying conditioner to people's hair to make them feel a little bit nicer, and there's no conviction, there's no prompting towards any life change, any truth, anything deeper, I'll just say this. I think there might be a problem if the world doesn't hate us. And again, here's the tug of war. Here's the tension. We are to love. We are to love with reckless abandon, but not with such recklessness that we don't stand for anything. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. So I'm going to ask our servers to go on back and begin prepping and passing the communion elements. And I just want to, I'll just close with just these two thoughts, because again, the question is around how in the world do we do that? How do we love? I guess I'll just say this first. Know this. It's not our job to determine how people view us. It's our job to love. It's our job to follow Jesus. But if in pursuit of Jesus, people from a worldly perspective can't understand theological convictions, that's not our job to necessarily make them like us. We could try to help them understand. But again, it's not our job to determine how people view us. Rather, I'll throw to this. It's our job to stand on truth in grace with love. It's our job to stand on truth in grace with love. That's what Jesus did. When Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, this is the thing that he's not ashamed of. He's not ashamed of Jesus when the adulterous woman is brought before him and Jesus says, whoever of you has no sin, you throw the first stone. That's grace. The fact that Jesus looks at this woman and he says, who's condemned you? And she says, no one, Lord. And he says, then I don't condemn you. That's love. That's grace. And in this beautiful way, he says, now go and sin no more. You don't have to do this. He stood for something. As our culture continues, and guys, it's going to continue and continue and continue. As our culture just continues to grab this rope, pull and pull and pull, and more churches and more people are just going to say, okay, fine. I look at Jesus and I say, his love wasn't passive. Paul said our love is supposed to compel us. His love has a purpose. It's there to transform and to change hearts and people. And I would argue this, the most loving thing that we can do is to point people towards that transformative power, as opposed to just giving in and not prompting anyone towards any sort of transformation. It's kind of heavy. But Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. My question this morning to you would be, are you ashamed of the gospel? That word gospel, it means good news. And it really points back to that image hanging up there, the cross. Which, by the way, Jesus even called the cross a stumbling block for many. And yet he went to it. And he died so that we could receive that good news of salvation. So as we head into this time of communion, let's thank him for that sacrifice, and let's thank him. Thank Jesus for being brave enough to walk a path where he says it was a path of being hated, and he walked it anyways. A path that led to an execution, and he walked it anyways. Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your word. God, I know this is a hard teaching today. But God, you never once promised us that walking with you would be easy or the popular choice. And so, Father, I pray for strength as we every day strive to walk, stand in truth, in grace, with love, to our friends, our coworkers, our neighbors, our loved ones, our family members, our spouses. God, thank you for the firmness of the gospel and the transformation that happens because of it. May we not be ashamed. In Jesus' name.